Good evening and welcome to this live debate for the 2016 U.S. Senate race for the state of New York. Joining us this evening are Green Party candidate Laverne Wilson and Libertarian candidate Alex Merced. Tonight we have an even dozen of topics ranging from economic inequality to net neutrality. Each candidate will have roughly 4 minutes to respond and a minute for rebuttal. We will begin with opening statements from each candidate. Alex Merced is a libertarian activist currently based out of Brooklyn, New York. He aims to focus on spreading a message of liberty that focuses not on the faults of government, but the power of individuals to solve problems without the sluggish and flawed nature of the bureaucracy of centralized governance. Alex Merced, your opening statement.
Hello, my name is Alex Merced, and I'm the 2016 Libertarian Party candidate for U.S. Senate. And while I'm running on the ideas of liberty and basically talking about how empowering solutions can be when individuals look at what they can do now instead of looking at what politically can be done after election after election after election of oftentimes not the results we necessarily want. But not only am I running on the issues, but I'm also running on changing the culture of politics. And I'm running on the idea that if I'm elected U.S. Senator, that I'm going to be transparent, I'm going to be thoughtful, I'm going to be accessible. People who message me on Facebook get answers. I always tell people what I think, and I try to be as transparent as possible. You can see everything I've ever pretty much had to say in the last 8 years over there on over 2,000 videos on YouTube. So the idea is I put myself fully out there. You can see my wedding video on my website. So transparency. And as U.S. Senator, the idea is that if I'm that transparent, I'm that accessible, the constituents of other senators, of other politicians will expect the same, and we'll begin seeing a new culture in politics. But on top of that, I also want to invite everybody of every party to consider a very important issue, and that's electoral reform. At the end of the day, any elected official, if they don't have competition, there's no reason for them to represent their constituents. So whether you're a Green Party, Libertarian Party, or any party, we need to work together to break down those barriers so that we can have open and competitive elections going forward, so that way representation does represent the people. And thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Laverne Wilson has been proudly anchored in Brooklyn for the last 3 years. Her work in activism and the arts has been featured in New York City, and she is currently pursuing an MA in Applied Theater from the CUNY School of Professional Studies, and has committed her life to using art and culture for profound social political change. Laverne Wilson, the Green Party nominee for U.S. Senate, your opening statement, please.
Thank you. My name is Laverne Wilson. I'm also known widely in the artist and activist communities as Dragonfly. I am proud that the Green Party called me personally and directly and asked me to be the candidate. And after much consideration and deliberation, I accepted this honor because the stakes are incredibly high right now for everybody. And in the same way that we are collectively trying to find the answers to all of our collective grievances, and as much as electoral reform is important, as much as we are fighting to maintain our access to the polls for that representation of the people, by the people, and for the people, we equally have a stake at fighting for access to the ballot. So with that, I am running for our lives. Running for our lives, meaning we have the economy on one side and the ecology on the other side, and most of us are in the squeeze between those two. We need to reset our country's priorities. Planet plus people plus peace equals prosperity, and it has to be in that very specific order. And the reason why is because Earth is the most common denominator that we all share. We're all Earthlings. So if it's not good for the planet, it's not good for the people. And so I'm standing up to be an advocate for the actual working class people, for the voiceless planet, to ensure peace around the world and create prosperity that is as universal as sunshine.
Okay, thank you, Laverne Wilson. We begin this evening with our topics. The first topic is inequality. The first opportunity to respond will be to Alex, followed by Robin. Alex, progressives such as Bernie Sanders and Jill Stein have made the issue of inequality a priority in this election season. Do you agree that inequality is a problem, and how would you address it as a U.S. Senator?
Now, the bottom line when it comes to inequality, we have to set terms because there's different types of inequality. There's inequality of wealth, there's inequality of income, and there's a lot of literature on the subject. But at the end of the day, when it comes to inequality can be caused by a lot of things. And let's focus on that wealth and income. It can be caused by just differences in performance, but it could also be caused by factors that are unfair per se. And I think there are government policies that do create a disparity of income, a disparity of opportunity. And the inequality that does exist in an unfair sense, I think exists because government has made opportunity more expensive. When you make opportunity more expensive, you make opportunities less available for those of lower income who can't. So one example I always like to point out is like occupational licensing. So that's actually what I do full time. I train people to get licenses on Wall Street. Sometimes I train high school dropouts, and sometimes I train CEOs of firms. But sometimes when I see that kid who's basically spending his savings to study for 6 months to get a license that has really little bearing to do with what he actually does on the job, so a lot of times they deplete their savings and then they don't even have the funds to complete the license just so they can get started, just so they can get trained for the job. They would have been much better off if they can get in the job. And that becomes even more worse for like a single mom with a child. She doesn't necessarily have the resources to take the time to get a license. So then only those who have the resources to take that time off, to spend those resources, have those opportunities. And that's the same thing we see also in investment. So after Sarbanes-Oxley, it made it pretty much where companies don't really go public anymore. So the companies, when they offer you the best investment opportunity, are no longer available to the everyday investor. Instead, the only people who really invest in companies when they first get started are wealthy accredited investors through what's called a Reg D private placement. But that's because they've made it too burdensome to be a public company earlier on in the life cycle. And at the same time, we've also just made it harder to attain skills and more expensive to attain skills and opportunities, entrepreneurship. Another way that people can pursue opportunities through entrepreneurship and more taxes, more regulations makes it more costly to do that. A wealthy person can afford to comply with regulations. They can afford to pay those taxes, so they can start a business and continue. But someone who's not so wealthy can't. So those three areas are regulations and taxes when it comes to investments, when it comes to occupational licensing, when it comes to entrepreneurship. All of that has made opportunities more expensive for those at the lower rung, which means they get stuck further and further behind and leaves more opportunities and disproportional access to opportunity at the upper levels that creates that inequality. But at the end of the day, it's a policy thing, not necessarily a thing that just naturally occurs in the market, as something a lot of times the argument is often made. Now, there is some inequality that naturally occurs, and there's some great books on the subject. Now, on the left and the right, one book I enjoyed was the Price of Inequality by Joseph Stiglitz, which talked about the difference between solving inequality before taxes, after taxes. Right now, I just started reading The Upside of Inequality by Edward Conard on the right. There's a great discussion on this topic, but at the end of the day, I think those areas that I just outlined before are areas where you can have a lot of change now.
Okay, thank you for that. Robin Laverne Wilson, your response.
So, inequality. What exactly is it? Well, let me frame it this way. The holy trinity of democracy through my eyes, are the union of freedom, equality, and justice. And they're all interconnected, and they all depend on each other. Making sure that everyone has equal access is an act of justice that leads to freedom, that ensures democracy. So we have to look at what's going on structurally and culturally, as well as economically, in order for us to have equality. We know, based upon where we are now compared to where we've come from with the civil rights movement, that we can change policy, but it doesn't necessarily change hearts and minds. So we have to simultaneously address structural racism and inequality, as well as change the culture so that we have a society that is way more dignified, respectful, and inviting of all people of all types. And furthermore, going back to making sure that people have the very basics that they need is actually ensuring human rights. And that act of justice to ensure basic human rights and dignity for everybody is the key to equality. So that means access to clean water, air, and land. It means access to wholesome, nutritious, and sustainable food sources. Equality also means affordable healthcare, being able to have a secure, stable roof over your head, and not having to devote the majority of your income to do that. It also means making sure that, once again, people are treated equally regardless of their gender, class, creed, culture, color, national origin, etc. So by addressing basic human rights and by readjusting the structure of our economy, and as we will probably get into later, also reforming the criminal justice system, those are some of the keys to fighting inequality. And inequality is what has everyone feeling so frustrated and disenfranchised in this campaign season. And it's not an identity issue, although there are different types of inequality based upon identity. So once again, we make sure everyone has the very basics that they need, and that addresses inequality, and that moves us forward as a society.
Thank you, Robin Laverne Wilson. Moving on to our next topic. This is regarding the Dakota Access Pipeline and the issue of renewable energy. The building of the Dakota Access Pipeline has been controversial as concerns about native burial grounds and potential pollution of the local drinking water have been represented by activists in the region and around the country. What are your thoughts on the building of the Dakota Access Pipeline and U.S. energy policy in general? We begin with Robin Laverne Wilson.
Oh, wow. As you can see by the button that I'm wearing, I'm in solidarity with Standing Rock and the water and earth protectors. There's two things at stake with DAPL. One is respecting the sovereignty and the sacred lands of the original Americans. The other thing that is also at stake is actually clean water. And third thing that is at stake is the way that the fossil fuel industry has continued to literally terrorize American people through their industry. So we need to start investing in a Green New Deal. We need to take all of this information, all of this infrastructure, and put it towards renewable resources. Now, let me point this out. To add insult to injury, or insult to energy, so to speak, none of the energy that is coming through the pipelines, none of the crude. There's also the threat of the oil bomb trains coming from the tar sands in Canada, passing through regular everyday communities. By chance, not if, but when any of those trains derail, that's equivalent to 2 million sticks of dynamite. That is a form of terror that the fossil fuel industry is imposing upon American people. The Dakota Access Pipeline is the reality and a symbol of a battle that is being fought all over this country in hundreds of communities, and bringing it home to New York State. Case in point, we have Spectra AIM Pipeline, in which incumbent Senator Chuck Schumer let over 20 million New Yorkers down by not stopping the construction of the Spectra AIM Pipeline, which is within 105 feet of Indian Point nuclear power plant, which is crumbling, dilapidated, and leaking radioactivity. Now, once again, it's not a matter of if, but when that pipeline or the nuclear power plant happen to fail, interact with each other, and now we have a 50-mile impact zone, which Chuck Schumer himself lives within, which makes you wonder, does he cherish money more than his own human life as well as that of others? So the Dakota Access Pipeline is a literal and symbolic fight that we have to collectively engage in against the fossil fuel industry, because none of the crude passing through those oil bomb trains or through those pipelines is even intended for American consumption. Let that sink in. It's not even intended for our use, and therefore contributes zero to our domestic energy security. Once again, Green New Deal. We have to start taking all of this capital, all of these resources, and investing in the cleanest, purest, most powerful nuclear fusion power plant, which is the sun. which is available to everybody in every community, and start decentralizing our power grid. So yeah, I'm against the Dakota Access Pipeline. I am against the Spectra AIM pipeline. I'm against the abuse of fossil fuel industries that literally have threatened American lives through contamination, leakage, explosions, etc. And we need to create a new energy infrastructure that protects everybody.
Thank you, Robin Laverne Wilson. Alex Merced, your response.
Basically, when it comes to energy, first let's talk about the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, when it comes to the pipeline, I don't have a particular goal of how that, or a particular view of how that issue should resolve itself. And just to kind of give some clarification on what the issue is, basically you have the pipeline that's being built over there, and basically there's an issue of where they're building the pipeline is that there's some Native American burial grounds. At the same time, there's also concerns about pollution, of the possible pollution if there was ever a spill of the Mississippi River, which is the drinking water for a lot of the areas. And those are fair concerns. And but at the same time, a lot of times people are trying to make it where it's an all one side or the other. There's either is a pipeline, there is no pipeline. The pipeline's already 60% built. So that's resources, actual steel, actual time that's already been implemented to create what they've created the pipeline so far. Some of the things I've heard are things like building pipelines so deep that it's below the aquifer, so technically if something did happen, it wouldn't damage the water. And I've heard other people suggest other ideas of alternate routes. At the end of the day, what's the best thing that's going to bring both parties to the table should be debated among them. But the thing is that let's put pipelines in the perspective. There's three ways you transport oil from point A to point B: train, truck, or a pipeline. And when it comes to which ones have the most frequent spills, oftentimes it's more frequently trains and trucks that result in spills more. So if the pipeline isn't built, it's not like that oil will not be transported at all. Instead, you're just going to have more of it transported by train and truck, which means you're actually increasing the possible harm of future spills per se. Now, I understand that we want to diversify our energy matrix, which I agree. I want there to be other technologies in energy. The problem is you never know exactly which ones are going to be the most viable, the most efficient, etc. So we tried to do this before when we tried to direct subsidies into ethanol, and that didn't quite work out so well and actually increased the price of food. And then we did under Obama, we did this whole subsidy of solar with companies like Solindra, who've gone out of business, Solar City in Buffalo, which is now starting to have some really bad financial numbers. Now, I'm not anti-solar. I think solar will be part of our energy mix. The thing is that when you pick companies or you pick a particular technology, you divest capital from other maybe just as green or just as efficient technologies that would have otherwise get it, but they don't fit into that gap of how you define that subsidy. So that's why you generally want a more market-friendly environment where basically all those alternatives, ideas that are not even out there yet, can get funding because you're not divesting or you're not directing funding somewhere in particular. And another thing to think about is making prices reflect the reality of the world, and that'll change the way people use energy. Such as right now we have liability caps on oil companies where we tell companies you can only get sued for this much. Why? If you are in business, you should be responsible for the actions that you take. So there shouldn't be a liability cap on any company of any sort. And liability is something that is important. And that would change and reflect the price of oil, and that will be reflected in people's decisions. One last point is our monetary policy of the last 8 years, that loose monetary policy, that low interest rate policy, led to a spur of investment in oil, which allowed for the collapse of the oil price, which has set us back when it comes to divesting from fossil fuels, because now they're cheaper than ever, and it's much harder to compete with them than ever because of our monetary policy.
May I respond?
Yes, we will now take a moment for 1-minute responses from each candidate, beginning with Robin Laverne Wilson.
I'd like to say that I agree that the prices of anything should definitely reflect the energy and the labor and everything that it takes to produce whatever is that commodity. However, it's urgent, it's crucial, it's overdue that we actively divest in fossil fuel. We don't need those pipelines. We can reallocate the same resources, the steel and whatnot. It was a bad investment. It's a bad investment in our future. It's a bad investment in our economy. And the failure of very specific industries and in terms of companies that mismanage themselves is not a fault of the solar innovation that we need, and has the potential to emancipate us from this toxic addiction to petroleum energy. And if anything, we should also start actively phasing out petroleum engineering departments in colleges and universities and consider it an obsolete technology, and instead invest heavily on innovative solar engineering departments across the country so that we can feed off of the potential and momentum of that innovation.
Thank you. Alex Merced, 1 minute.
Okay, my only concern is, while I can understand the desire for a lot of those changes, my only concern is when you start asking government to make those changes, asking government to tell schools what kind of programs they should have. Because once you set the precedent that government can tell a university, these are the programs you have, what stops it when a different administration starts saying, okay, now you have to have X and Y program that you don't like in there, or they say the only program you can have is petroleum engineering. So my danger always is once you ask government to make the changes that you want, then you also give them the power to make the changes that you don't want. I'm not saying these changes would be bad ideas. A lot of these maybe be good things, and maybe these are things that we should advocate for, but I'd rather that we advocate for it by voluntarily investing in the companies and the technologies that we believe in, and in even creating new schools, or basically using your dollars to study in programs that reflect your values, instead of asking government to force these things to happen.
Thank you. And we now move on to the subject of net neutrality. Open and free communication via the internet has allowed transparency of our public and private institutions, provided people new economic opportunities, and has been a game changer throughout our society. Concerns over a free internet generated the net neutrality movement, resulting in the government reclassifying the internet and internet service providers as common carriers like telephone companies. Do you feel that net neutrality is sufficiently protected by this government oversight? And we begin with Alex Merced.
Got it. When it comes to net neutrality, when net neutrality began, it began out as a concern for free expression on the internet. The idea is that the internet as this force that gave everybody equal access to be able to do business, to talk to each other, etc. And we see the power of Facebook, Twitter. I mean, right now, we got excluded from a debate on October 30 with Chuck Schumer, and we're using the internet to be able to have access to all of you. Many of you are from across the country. So the internet is something that it needs to be protected. Now, I do share concerns over asking the FEC to take over. Because when you reclassify something as a common carrier, that means they can also create rules. They said it because they wanted the government to protect it. What's happened over the net neutrality debate is that over time it got away from the idea of free expression into sort of a debate over what's the best pricing model over the internet. So basically, the idea that the only pricing model there should ever be is that everyone pays the same price for the same amount. And then this has actually ended up hurting poor people around the world, because in places like India and the Philippines, people get internet for free from Facebook. Facebook pays for a very limited internet, but it's free. And they're able to access Facebook, which allows them to pursue, look for jobs, talk to people, meet people, get education, but only through Facebook, because that's what they can get for free. That's what Facebook pays for. I mean, you still have normal internet access that's accessible at normal prices. But the idea is but in India, they ended up, because of net neutrality arguments, they ended up banning free Facebook, which actually only just limits the access that people have to Facebook. And now and what happened is that because of this whole net neutrality push to have government get involved, they reclassified it as a common carrier. And the result is, recently, earlier this year, our opponent, Chuck Schumer, he proposed a bill saying we want to force telephone companies to block robocalls, those automated calls that I know we all hate. Of course, makes a great headline, as Schumer always loves to have. But the problem is, the only reason the government would have the authority to do that is because telephone companies are regulated as a common carrier. So if you tell telephone companies that you can block the content that goes over their lines, then it's not a huge stretch. It sets the precedent that you could suddenly start saying anything regulated as a common carrier can have that same process, and now the government will be in a place where it can block content over internet lines, which was the whole fear with net neutrality to begin with. And now we're setting that stage, and the government has a much more interest to squelch a speech of opposing political views than necessarily companies have, when mostly their concern is just how to deliver you better ads, which is, to me, a lot less of a concern than preventing political opposition. So I'm very concerned about this. I'm very concerned about Chuck Schumer's proposal earlier in the year.
Robin Laverne Wilson, your response.
I I think that the elimination of robocalls is almost insignificant compared to all the other things that are at stake in maintaining net neutrality. And I think that net neutrality is a term that encompasses a lot of different issues and circumstances that affect access to information and communication. I would even at this point even say that internet access is pretty much a human right, especially considering the power that it gives us to educate ourselves and each other and make a more informed decision about things like how to vote in an election. To amplify what you said, this right here is how the internet is an extension of the fourth estate, the media, the freedom of press, for us to continue to check and balance and to have independent media that is not corporate controlled. Another important thing about net neutrality is that it in itself is also wrapped up in this vision that I have for a Green New Deal and updating infrastructure, because the internet at this point is like a utility. It is a public resource, much like broadcast media, terrestrial radio was intended to belong to the public, but became monopolized and corporate controlled. So now we have a very small number of people controlling the flow of information, and we're at risk at the very same thing happening with the internet. So we have to update the infrastructure to expand and ensure its accessibility. We have to make sure that it stays democratic and that is not monopolized. And we also have to make sure that that it is, again, made accessible to all people, that we should decentralize it as well in the same way that we can decentralize our public utilities, so that there is less of a risk of a blackout if something catastrophic happens to our information grid. And so on all of those issues, from the economic to the cultural to the constitutional, we have to maintain net neutrality.
Thank you. Alex Merced, 1 minute.
Okay, so a couple points I wanted to make is that I totally agree on the whole idea of decentralization. Decentralization of all institutions is generally good, because again, whenever you have centralization, you have a head on the snake. All you have to do is cut the head off, and the whole thing falls apart. And that goes for all institutions. That's why I'm generally against anyone providing everything for everyone, because then you put too much risk in one place. But two, as far as decentralization of the internet, that's starting to happen. So regardless of what happens to the internet as we know it, there's already technology out there for more peer-to-peer internet technology. So even if the internet did get co-opted that day, once kind of like Bitcoin does for currency, these new peer-to-peer technologies will basically make it where it's impossible to have that sort of centralized control of communication technology. And those are the kind of things that are really going to hold our institutions accountable going forward. But I also get concerned when we take anything that is good, anything that has positive externalities, and try to call it and say it has a human right, or it's a human right, because then what happens is that then it changes our relationship with it. I'm not saying that we shouldn't tell people that they should have it, but when someone thinks of something as a privilege versus a right, people treat it differently. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Robin Wilson, 1 minute.
I think that the access to information, freedom of press, freedom of information, freedom to organize are absolutely human rights and are the cornerstone of democracy. Once again, when you have a mainstream corporate media that's tightly controlling information and also serves as a propaganda tool for the oligarchy, at this moment, especially the internet is the only recourse that we have to keep ourselves informed and in touch with each other locally and globally. So yes, I firmly believe that access to the internet, access to information, education, organizing, etc. is a human right. Hence, uphold net neutrality.
Thank you. We now move on to criminal justice reform. The Black Lives Matter movement has been visible and a controversial entity in advocating reforms in the criminal justice system. Some reforms, such as body cameras on police, have become more widely adopted, yet controversial police incidents keep happening. What are your thoughts and the role of the federal government in these issues? We begin with Robin Laverne Wilson.
So, there's two things that need to happen. There needs to be a grassroots up cultural shift and a top-down federal shift in the way that we do our policing in this country. Now, yes, Black Lives Matter is on the front lines of this issue and is probably the most vocal group of Americans who are speaking out about something that is literally ruining lives. And at the same time, we need to also keep in mind that if you have an allergic reaction to the word black, keep in mind that it's not just Black Americans who are suffering under the corruption of police and law enforcement. There's also Native Americans, there's the poor and the homeless, there's the mentally ill, there's the queer and transgender community, there's undocumented immigrants. All of them have been victimized. There are regular middle-class Americans who have been victimized by the corruption of their local police, who confiscate their property and reallocate it for themselves. So, if anything, taking the identity out of the issue of criminal justice reform and look at the big picture, let's all be grateful that this is something that has been blown up into everybody's attention, is on our radar, and needs to be fully, thoroughly addressed if we really are a country that stands for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So in order to reform our criminal justice system, again, from the top up and from the top down and the bottom up simultaneously, because we can change policy, we can change laws, but we have to change the culture and the hearts and minds and the way that we relate to each other. Another form of justice. So in conclusion, we definitely need a federal mandate where we have independent third-party investigations whenever there are acts of police brutality, homicide, death in police and law enforcement custody. We need to change and completely in the for-profit prison industry, warehousing human beings for profit, which is also being done to immigrants and asylum seekers throughout this country. We need to have community control of their local police, because the police need to be a friend and ally to their community instead of criminalizing individuals. And we also need to make sure that the community control is a powerful, strong enough counterweight to the control that the police unions have to the way that community policing is done. And indict and convict and send these killer cops to jail.
Thank you. Alex Merced, your response.
Got it. So at the end of the day, all these incidents that have happened over the last couple of years, it's not that they weren't happening before. It's just become more transparent because technology has gotten better. It does raise questions. And again, each of these situations are different. So they have certain different situations. And how do you fix the problem with each particular police department can be different from police to police department. That's why I do tend to fear the idea of using federalization in the same way I fear federalization with education and trying to create universal standards. I don't want a common coreization of policing. But I do think there is a need for communities to get in touch with their police departments and have a discussion and see if things like de-escalation training, body cams, a lot of the other things that have been discussed over the last couple of years may be appropriate in their local police departments. But that should be something that we should be encouraging people to do. And I would, as a U.S. Senator, I would go and I would encourage local communities here within New York to have that, build that bridge. Because some police departments have a great relationship with their community. Go like the Facebook page for the Alpharetta, Georgia police department. I don't even live in Alpharetta, Georgia, and I love their Facebook page because they put out fun videos about local things. So they really engage with their community, which creates a different dynamic. But I mean, part of the reasons why there is this sort of, let's say, barrier that has prevented this sort of relationship to be built is partly it's because of the drug war that has created this sort of and just over criminalization in general of just making everything a crime. We see a lot of, but especially in the drug war, where people are, when we talk about filling up jails, I mean, a lot of those people are non-violent drug offenders. They're fathers, they're brothers who may have just smoked a joint and now they're spending 10 years in jail, and that's just completely unfair. It wastes resources. And then if you're someone who was in 10 years in federal prison for smoking a joint and now you're in prison with rapists and murderers, that's going to change you after 10 years, and you're going to be more likely to commit other crimes afterwards when they probably would have never otherwise committed any other crimes otherwise, but we put them in that situation. We've decided to put them into that environment. And the thing is that even once you're within that system, things can be really unfair. And a lot of that has, again, to do with immunity. So, for example, we have liability caps on oil companies that make people take more risks. When people don't feel the full brunt of the risks of the decisions they're taking, they sometimes make different decisions. In law, there's judicial immunity, where judges have decisions. And I know people who've personally been affected by this. And this is all because of a Supreme Court case called Stump v. Sporkman. And Stump v. Sporkman, a mother actually had her daughter sterilized by a judge. The judge ordered that girl to have her fallopian tubes tied. And they told her her appendix was being removed. And later on, when she decided she was going to have kids when she was older and married, she finds out that this was happened, and when she sued the judge, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, sorry, you can't hold judges liable in any context. So there's all sorts of different aspects of the justice system that we need to look at to provide accountability within the justice system. I do not want the federal government standardizing necessarily community policing, but I do think communities need to talk to their police, and I think in the federal government we do need to rethink other aspects of our justice system to make sure all actors within that justice system are held or have accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 minute responses, beginning with Robin Laverne Wilson.
So there is a federal statute that influences standards for policing, and it's called the Constitution of the United States. And there is a rampant abuse of constitutional rights, especially the right to life, that police stations across the country are violating. In terms of communities and police departments talking to each other, the impetus at this point needs to start with the police departments, not the people, because the people have already spoken up and said that they're sick and tired of all of this abuse. I spoke to people in Utica, New York, who actually were trying to organize Black Lives Matter movement and said that it was very swiftly suppressed. So what is the recourse when you have a community that wants to be more involved in the reformation of their local police departments, but are being suppressed by the police departments themselves? Which, once again, I'm not saying that the federal government has to have a very strict standard and say that this is exactly how you have to do it. However, the constitutional standard is you cannot continue to abuse life and liberty, pursuit of happiness, and funneling people straight from school into the prison pipeline.
Thank you. Alex Merced, 1 minute.
Basically, the only thing I want to add on to that is, actually, no. I mean, I agree that we need to be concerned about that whole aspect of people going from, you have high school kids being thrown in jail over really silly crimes. And now, again, when it comes to the Constitution, though, you have two amendments that to me are the most underrated amendments in the Bill of Rights, and that's the 9th and the 10th. People always talk about the 10th. The 10th is the one that says if the powers were not enumerated to the federal government in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it's the power of the states. But then people think that means they get concerned that then maybe the states will just do anything. But they can't, because you have the 9th Amendment. So even if the states abridge individual rights, you have the 9th Amendment, which protects individual rights from the federal and the state government. So at the end of the day, the 9th Amendment is the end-all protection of an individual's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But at the end of the day, we just need more accountability and address the drug war, and you fix it.
Excuse me, moderator. In honor of this wonderful moment of agreement that Alex Merced and I had, and also in honor of having a more congenial political culture, may I propose a song break? The pipeline song.
Okay, go for it.
Because when we think of pipelines, these are two issues that interplay. We're talking about the fossil fuel industry pipeline earlier, and now we're talking about the school to prison pipeline. And I firmly believe that by following the money and connecting the dots, the same handful of people are profiting from our collective pain. And so, in honor of our agreement in that there needs to be urgent criminal reform, we don't need your pipelines. No, 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 no. We don't need your pipelines. What do we need? All we need is the sunshine, and everything will turn out fine. We don't need your pipelines. Fossil fuel or school to prison. Yeah.
Nice.
Shake on that. Moderator, next question.
Alex Merced, in the interest of equal time, is there anything that you would like to sing?
Well,
Did you have a band?
I do music. I do play guitar. If people want to see me play a song or two, they can go to music.alexmerced.com. But yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Moving on to the issue
Yes.
of NSA surveillance. U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer has been quoted saying he is, quote, to the right of Rand Paul, unquote, when it comes to surveillance and mass data collection by the NSA. Do you believe that the government should have the power to collect bulk metadata without a specific warrant to collect that data? We begin with Alex Merced.
Yeah, no, this is one of those issues where I stand with Rand Paul 100% on, because that's the Fourth Amendment, and I am all about defending the Bill of Rights. And basically, when the government's collecting metadata, so the idea here is they're not necessarily collecting your tweets and your Facebook posts, but the way they look at it is the aggregate data and what's called metadata. But the problem is they're collecting it without necessarily having a specific warrant on you or me. They don't have a warrant saying we want Alex Merced's information on his Facebook information or his Twitter information, but they're collecting it. And yes, they theoretically have to go get a piece of paper so they can search the data, but they already have the data, and that already makes us vulnerable to begin with. Okay, so basically once the government has that, and we've heard, I mean, take a look at I hate to bring this up, but the Hillary Clinton emails and everyone talking about Russia hacking it and people talking about China hacking the government. So we know that there's people trying, cybersecurity is an issue. Why we would want to make those cybersecurity vulnerabilities worse by having a huge database of the metadata of everyone in the country? That's a huge vulnerability. And that just brings me back to encryption, because we had that whole situation with the iPhone earlier in the year where the government wanted to force iPhone to basically decrypt or develop the technology to decrypt their phone. The problem with that is, you make it easier to find information on that one phone, but then you make it easier to decrypt someone else's phone. So what if some other party, some nefarious actor now who since this technology exists, which didn't exist before, is able to break into a top CEO's phone and use information on their phone to block them for corporate secrets or for political power or of a politician's phone. So you make people vulnerable when people don't have their privacy. And the people who have privacy have power, and the people who should have power is the people. So over the years, we've had that balance of power change, where governments become more private, and the people have had less privacy. And that's a signal of the change and the shift in powers that we've had in society. And that's what I got to say about that.
Thank you. Robin Laverne Wilson, your response.
Yeah, I have to say, I think I'm with you on that one. I don't have a song for it, but
Oh, good.
but absolutely, I don't understand how being constantly watched against your knowledge. Well, it's not against our knowledge anymore. At this point, everyone knows how much we're being watched, but definitely without our consent. That's makes me feel violated even just saying it. It's one of the most dystopian and fascist overreaches of government power, and the way that it's commingled with corporations is also pretty much the textbook definition of fascism, when you have the corporations and the government. Case in point, AT&T has been singled out as a corporation that is working directly with police departments to provide our information without a warrant. And then once again, like you said, once they provide the information, which has been paid for handsomely to AT&T, then they go and they get the paperwork to get the information. I was in Midtown just last week, and I saw a windowless AT&T building that was completely flanked by police cars, NYPD. Now, I can't think of a more plain and graphic example of how the two are completely intermingled and are being completely opaque about the machinations going on behind the curtain, but want to know every single thing about what we say, what we read, what we buy. And it also, I feel like it pre-criminalizes us. You're gathering this information in the event we might do something wrong, but that something wrong might be an unpopular idea. In fact, a lot of what both of us are saying might be considered unpopular ideas by the powers that be, and not knowing how that information may be used and spun against us to criminalize us. So, if anything, we need to turn the tables, and we need to demand the same kind of transparency from our government. What if we knew in real time, all the way down to the bottom ledger for the budget of Sharpies for every department in government, where our money was being spent in our name and for what reasons? The tables need to be turned, and the government needs to come out of our private business and start having some accountability for all the abuses of power that they've been doing to us.
Thank you. We'll now take a moment for 1-minute responses, beginning with Alex Merced.
Okay, so the only thing I want to add to that is I agree. I mean, basically, the culture has changed into this sort of guilty until proven innocent culture, especially with that, with the way, as you mentioned, pre-crime. But I mean, that has stretched further into other areas. I mean, take a look at after 9/11, we have this no-fly list. While I understand the concerns for security, but it's not like there's a process or a due process for getting on that list, and this is where due process gets in. When we start saying it's okay for government to just make lists and take people's rights for putting on a list where there was no court, no judge, no jury, put on there, you really start blurring the line of where our due process rights begin and end. But also on top of that, you have the IRS, where basically there's another place where it's guilty until proven innocent. They accuse you of something wrong with your taxes, then they can come freeze your assets and take everything away, and you don't have the resources anymore to defend yourself, to hire a lawyer to protect yourself, because they already took the stuff away and sold it. And the thing is, when you have a complex tax code, this huge behemoth of a tax code that we have now, everyone is probably in violation of the tax code because they made it so hard. It's like it's impossible to do it right, and that's why we need a simpler tax code. Go for it.
Okay, Robin Laverne Wilson, 1 minute.
I think I've said my fill about NSA surveillance. Just stay out of our business. Moving on.
Thank you. Moving on to the issue of immigration. When it comes to immigration, people have fears of lower wages from an influx of skilled labor, concerns over security, and even concerns over changing cultural balances. Are those fears justified? What are your thoughts, Robin Laverne Wilson?
So, looking at the word immigration, and the root of it is to migrate, and to migrate is also a human right. Again, the biggest common denominator that we all share is this planet. Also, number two, people usually migrate because they're in search of something better, or things are not safe or stable or secure where they are. And number three, the United States has consistently branded itself as the #1 destination if you want a better life and you have big dreams. And then you wonder why we have so many people wanting to immigrate to the United States. Now, I think that the way to reform immigration also includes changing our approach to foreign policy. Because once again, usually people don't leave their homeland. And I also want to take a moment to salute all the many brave people who, whether they're documented or not, who left the comfort of their homes and their culture looking for something better for themselves and their families. And so they come here, and there's this torturous, protracted, bureaucratic process for asylum seekers, naturalization process, immigration, etc. that is confusing and inefficient, and a lot of bureaucratic red tape. We need to give a lot of oversight and overhaul into that whole entire process, while simultaneously addressing our foreign policy, so that we're not disrupting the politics and the economies of other countries worldwide, where people can actually thrive and survive where they are. This also ties into many of our foreign trade policies. Again, that disrupts economies, so people have no choice but to leave where they are. And finally, another major indicator to the massive waves of immigration that we're in now and are going to continue to be in is the effects of climate change. They are coming regardless of what we do from this point going forward to reduce our carbon footprint. It's been proven and said over and over that a huge part of what has disrupted Syria is the effect of climate change and how people are unable to even grow and provide food for themselves. And that's just a taste of what's going to happen. So once again, we need to live up to the standards that we've claimed to set as a welcoming home for people who have big dreams, want a better life for themselves and their families. We need to change our foreign policy and our trade agreements so that people can have a viable life, quality of life, wherever they are in the world. And finally, we need to clean up the bureaucracy and red tape of the actual immigration and naturalization process.
Thank you. Alex Merced, your response.
Okay, so yeah, I'm very pro-immigration. I'm the son of an immigrant. My mom's from Guatemala, and this ties in also the security aspect of it, because basically my mom grew up in Guatemala in the 50s. In the 50s, there was regime change in Guatemala, where the U.S. government backed a coup of the democratically elected leader Jacobo Arbenz. And that created instability that my grandma had to raise her 9 kids in that region. And that instability also created a demand for immigration, people wanting to leave Guatemala to pursue places that were more stable. So if we don't look at our own policy decisions and see how that contributes to some of the frustrations on the border, we're not going to be able to make a dent. But at the same time, what is illegal immigration? Illegal immigration is a black market for immigration. And whenever you have a black market, it's because you don't have enough of a legal market. Same issue when you see the black market in drugs, same thing with the black market in anything. When people can't do things legally, they do things secretly. So basically, if you want to cure the illegal immigration and the frustration, the property damage on the border, what you need to do is fix the legal immigration system and make it a more robust, more generous system. There still needs to be proper vetting. We need to make sure that people, go through the proper checks, health, background. But otherwise, we shouldn't have the complex quota system. People shouldn't be waiting 10 years. I know I met an actually they're a U.S. citizen now when I was in Syracuse for the New York State Fair, and this person had someone that they were sponsoring, or a family member of theirs was sponsoring to come here, and they waited 10 years, and they were just about at the front of the line, but that person who sponsored them died. So then the person who I was talking to decided to become the new sponsor, but that moved them all the way back in the line, and they would have to wait another 10 years all over again just because of that misfortune of a family member dying. These are the kind of things that we need to sit down and take a look at the system and make sure that it's fair. But and we always the problem is people aren't one-dimensional. Every person that comes here is not just another worker competing for you for your wages. They're your next customer. Mm-hmm. They're the next entrepreneur who starts a business. I mean, when you have a diverse many cultures, new types of businesses. Okay, so for example, you have all these sort of cultural food places. They wouldn't have existed if other types of people weren't here. And at the same time, now you're starting to see those kind of cuisines and foods and cultural and basic cultural works begin to be combined with others of other cultures, creating a whole new products that didn't exist before, whole new demands, whole new industries. So there's only upside in immigration. Yes, we need to be concerned about security concerns, and we need proper vetting and stuff like that. But we also have to make a lot of the reasons why we need vetting is because of our decisions and our foreign policy overseas, specifically when it comes to regime change.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Robin Laverne Wilson, would you like a minute to respond?
Sure. I agree with everything you said. And I personally feel that comes from me having a matriotic rather than a patriotic worldview that once again sees our commonality in terms of we share this planet, we share the resources, we can create these political boundaries, but at the end we are ultimately one species that have everything shared at stake. I moved to New York City. I would say I'm an immigrant too, from Texas, the Republic of Texas, because New York has always represented for me that the freedom to be free, to express yourself culturally. Mm-hmm. New York State also always represented the terminal destination in the Underground Railroad. So there's also a historic association with the freedom that New York State represents for me in terms of my ancestry, which is all the more reason why I can definitely understand and appreciate the immigrant experience, especially from overseas. And we definitely need to stop punishing the asylum seekers from Latin America that are being warehoused in the detention centers down in Texas. This is, again, another human rights abuse that's a result of our policies.
Thank you. Alex Merced, 1 minute.
Yep. I just want to say that's a good point, pointing out that a migrant from Texas. So the idea that she moved from Texas to New York. But that's true. At the end of the day, a lot of these states, when we started out as a country, we were called the United States of America because each state was a country. The state's a word for country. So one of the things we wanted was to have free travel here because we understood the economic benefit. The fact that you can move out of New York whenever you want and go to, let's say, New Jersey, holds the government of New York accountable. Because if they tax too much, they regulate too much, people will move. And that's what's happening in New York. You actually have a net emigration of taxpayers. Taxpayers are leaving New York City. I mean, not New York City, but New York as a state. And bottom line, that free travel holds governments accountable. So we want there to be more free travel of people because it'll make governments less oppressive and more accountable to people and their rights.
Thank you. We next tackle the issue of trade. Many have been concerned that trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, and NAFTA are not as good for the country as many politicians might say. What do you think of these trade agreements, and what would be your ideal trade policy? We begin with Alex Merced.
Okay, so bottom line is I am very pro-trade. I think nations should trade with each other. That makes us more prosperous because other countries, they're able to sell us their goods. We're able to sell them our goods. We get new types of goods. I mean, again, go into your grocery and see all the new types of products that you have that you wouldn't have on your shelf otherwise if we weren't trading with other nations. And that allows you to have a richer variety of different options. But trade agreements like the TPP and NAFTA are not necessarily free trade. They're not free trade at all. There's nothing. They're not just saying, "Hey, let's trade with you." Instead, what you're having is you're having the large corporations of both countries sit at the table and negotiate a set of rules that make sure the large corporations of both countries are okay, but the medium to small companies in both countries, they're not able to compete. Their ability for new entrants to those markets becomes squashed, and then you have terribly inefficient trade, because then what happens is that you have something in the U.S. that a piece gets built here, it gets shipped to Germany and assembled a little bit more, then shipped to China to get assembled a little bit more, and then sent again to the U.S. to be assembled, but then shipped again to Germany to be sold for the final time. Like, that's inefficient. It's overly bureaucratic. At the end of the day, what we do want is we want to be able to freely trade with people across the world. That brings people together. Countries that you trade with aren't countries that you fight with. So a trade-based policy is a peace-based policy. But again, these trade agreements oftentimes do all sorts of negative things, especially when it comes to like intellectual property law. And when it comes to really rethinking intellectual property and just the ideas of intellectual property, I really recommend reading the work and the writings of Stephan Kinsella. In his book, just look up Stephan Kinsella, read what he has to say, and you can start seeing what are the problems when it comes to our current intellectual property regime and our thinking about it as far as a good property rights framework. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Robin Laverne Wilson, your response.
Yes. So as far as I'm concerned, the TPP is TP and needs to be completely flushed.
That's good.
NAFTA was the most horrific, disgraceful form of policy and trade that completely alienated all of our neighbors south of the border. And I really appreciate what you just said, that countries that trade with each other don't fight with each other, and that it's a peace-based policy. And that's what I would especially like to stimulate, not just on a macro but a micro scale, and that the key to conquering these kinds of abusive trade agreements is, again, to decentralize the economy. What frightens me the most about the TPP, and I'm also aware of the TTIP, which is its counterpart over in Europe, and they're all interconnected, is that it basically removes the sovereign rights of nations and local communities, and are going to be held accountable for fictitious, speculative profits that the corporations claim that they would be making had that nation or community not contested their exploitative practices. That's really concerning when you have corporations having way more power over communities than the actual government and regular everyday people and the stakes that they have within their community. It makes corporations the judge, the jury, and the executioner in any disputes ongoing, and makes them completely devoid of any accountability to the planet and the people. I would also tie this in the same, it's not that different from, I think, what Citizens United has done to the political process and monopolized it in terms of with its might makes right, which isn't always right. And I would also recommend that people check out The Best Democracy Money Can Buy by Greg Palast. It's available as a documentary, as a book, and even as a comic book. So there's several ways to access the incredible research and heavy lifting that he did on just how the oligarchy is encroaching upon countries and communities and nations like vultures to take away their sovereign rights and impose their will, which has already led to and will continue to lead to destruction upon the planet and people.
Thank you. Alex Merced, would you like 1 minute?
Yes, I just want to address Citizens United real quick, just because not so much specifically Citizens United, but the whole idea of putting rules on money and politics, just because, again, black markets. When you make something harder to do, you create black markets, and that's what's happened. We have less transparency now in what money is affecting our politics because we try to control it so much. And the thing is, one thing, their studies have shown that the effect of a lot of campaign finance reform is what it does. It favors incumbents, because basically, in that case, the only one who's going to be making generally. You have to make a lot of large contributions, and people are always going to be more likely to contribute to incumbents. So incumbents are always able to get a huge stockpile of cash, while very few people want to take a chance on a competitor, a new entrant into the political market. So they depend a little bit more on having a handful of larger donors, because they're the only ones taking a chance on them. They're taking a risk on them. So then what happens? Ever since we've had more and more campaign finance, we've had less and less, let's say, turnover in who's in office since then. And these are facts that you can take a look at studies. Check out learnliberty.org where they have a video just on that.
I would like to just say that control is not the same thing as accountability, and that the federal government isn't necessarily controlling, but making sure that corporations are accountable. Also with the electoral process, thank you for bringing up our incumbent. Chuck Schumer has not even campaigned, and he's got stockpiles of cash from the usual suspects.
$27 million.
Woo! Was it Merrill Lynch, Blackstone, all the blue chip companies and so on. So I think this is part of a bigger conversation that we all collectively need to have in terms of how we're going to reform the way our elections work, the way the government works, and how are we going to decentralize and hold entities accountable, whether it's the federal government holding them accountable or local communities.
Thank you. And that brings us to our next topic, which is the issue of budget deficits. The U.S. debt is about $19.8 trillion, up from $5.6 trillion in the year 2000. We have over tripled the U.S. debt during the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations. We are now at 104% debt as a ratio to GDP. Should this be a policy priority? What are your thoughts on reducing the deficit and managing the U.S. debt? We will begin with Robin Laverne Wilson.
When I reflect on the numbers you gave me of our GDP and the debt, it's very interesting. If we take that example and we scale it to any economy, let's scale it to just an average American, New Yorker, individual, household, with the same kind of numbers and ratio, they would be living hand to mouth. They'd probably potentially be struggling to stay in their homes, etc. And so I'm trying to understand how we, the richest country in the world, are operating at such a catastrophic GDP ratio. It's frightening. And the root of this problem are two things: the Federal Reserve and fractional banking. We need to democratize the Federal Reserve, because when you are creating debt in order to create money, and that's inherent in the process, of course we're going to be bankrupt. And then when you take fractional banking, where we're also creating money with imaginary magic numbers, there's nothing to base it on. And that's, more importantly, it's enriching a handful of people through this Ponzi scheme, while it's cheating and corrupting and bankrupting regular American people. So we need to change our currency to base it on something that's real, base it on real commodities. We need to base it on the actual value of the labor and the resources that go into manufacturing, as well as bringing manufacturing back to hyperlocal communities instead of exporting debt, low-wage jobs, and war across the world. By decentralizing the economy, we put the power literally back into regular people's hands. I would love to see a movement where we can mushroom and stimulate community-owned banking and utilities, another form of decentralization. I would love to see an investment and stimulation of more worker-owned cooperatives, all the way down to the brick and mortar, so that small town Main Street America actually has a literal investment in their community and can stand up against these big corporations that are bankrupting their communities and exporting all of the production overseas.
Thank you. Alex Merced, your response.
Yes. So bottom line is, our debt is a huge issue. I mean, right now what you hear is politicians telling you about how the deficit has gone down over the last few years, and that is the case. And the reason why the deficits were so huge after 2008 is because so many companies lost so much money that you had huge, massive losses to write off. There was several years where companies were pretty much just not paying taxes, writing off all those losses that they had lost in 2008, and now that's starting to work its way through. So that's why I was always sort of against the whole logic of, oh, we need to raise taxes now. No, you wait long enough, those losses go through, those losses will work themselves out, and you're starting to see that increase in revenue. But the thing is, what makes our debt even more dangerous is our interest rate policy. As Robin pointed out, the Federal Reserve and monetary policy is a huge issue that is not talked about near enough. But right now we have interest rates pretty much at zero. So we're paying very little, almost zero interest on our debt. Now, the thing is that can't happen forever. Okay, for people to be, if you're a bank right now, the reason why you don't see banks lending money is why would you lend money at 0%? Okay, low interest rate policy is just as tight as high interest rate policy. And so eventually interest rates do need to go back up, but when that happens, that's going to destroy our budget. That's going to crowd out all the spending on all the things that you care about, because we've borrowed so much money over the years, whether it's for a lot of it has to do with a lot of our military intervention, a lot of it has to do with our response to the 2008 crisis, what I always like to say is that read the book The Forgotten Depression by James Grant. There was a recession in 1920. There was very little, and it was just as bad as the recession in 1929, if not worse. But there was very little government response to it, and the economy healed itself almost in less than a year. While in 1929, where you had a very conservative response to it, you had a recession that lasted damn near a decade. And just kind of like how you're seeing this recession sort of drag out, and you're starting to see sort of that stagnation occur again. What happens sometimes if you slow down the bleeding, it slows down the process of healing. Basically, you can't rebuild a house until you finish demolishing the old house. So we've hurt ourselves, and at the same time we've increased our debt in doing so. But low interest rate policy also affects inequality, because to create low interest rates, you have to increase the money supply, and you create an inflationary environment. Even if price inflation doesn't happen right away and happens down the line, it diminishes wages of workers and their savings, and increases the prices of assets, which are predominantly owned by wealthier people. So you're essentially transferring from from the bottom up when you practice low interest rate policy, which is the kind of policy that people advocate for because they want government to spend more. So the more we advocate for more government spending, the more you're going to push interest rate policy to be low interest rate policy, which creates inequality, which it contributes to inequality in the first place. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. We will now take 1-minute responses, beginning with Robin Laverne Wilson.
So one of the main ways that we can also immediately deal with our budget deficit, in addition to
I love talking about this stuff, and I love listening to it.
yeah. Oh,
Hey, everybody.
yes. Hi. Can y'all hear? Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Hello.
Okay.
All right.
I
I think you were in the middle of saying...
Well, we're not sure exactly when the sound cut off, so why don't, Alex, if you could maybe just...
Do a quick response?
Actually, sorry, Robin, you had the first 1-minute response. So we'll do a 1-minute response from you, and then a 1-minute response from Alex, and then we'll move on.
All right, so I'll abbreviate how to deal with the budget deficit. First of all, cut our military spending, stop giving money hand over fist to human rights abusers worldwide. Stop externalizing the responsibility and accountability for bankrupting our economy and start imprisoning the bankers at the top who were directly affected by that. And I also understand that there was a request by viewers for a song break. So, I have an economic song I think I can offer. Oh, 15. Oh, 15. Oh, 15, please pay me. Or more. And before I be a wage slave, I'll keep fighting till I'm in my grave to form a union where I work so I can eat and feed my family and live with dignity, decentralize the economy. Ooh.
Nice. And just one quick point. I agree with about foreign aid that we do need to rethink a lot of our approach to foreign aid. But last time we had a debate over there on the Pantsuit Politics podcast. So if you haven't heard that debate, please check it out. I mentioned that people should read a book, or many books, by an economist by the name of William Easterly. I accidentally said Westerly in the podcast. His name is William Easterly. So I'll point you guys to that, but let's move on.
Okay, we will move on to the issue of executive power, especially regarding the issue of unilateral drone strikes and executive orders. Barack Obama has used executive orders to circumvent gridlock in Washington on issues like immigration and energy regulation. Despite the merits of these policies, many may feel that it upsets the checks and balances of the three branches of government. do you feel that it is okay to expand executive power to achieve legislative goals, or does the constitutional process outweigh a president's policy agenda? We begin with Alex Merced.
Bottom line is that the process is very important, because at the end of the day, once power begins to centralize, and that's what happens when you have power grabs by different levels of government, you have less accountability. Like, what's supposed to happen is that a president's supposed to make their case to the legislature. And I understand the frustration Obama's had over the last 8 years. I know the Congress has not necessarily been the easiest to work with. That's the nature of politics, though. You have to build those bridges. That's what separates basically that's what separates people who are basically good at moving things forward versus those that don't. Those who can bring people to the table and move things forward. But basically, I understand the immediacy of wanting to move things on education, on energy and immigration, and I'm very sympathetic to the changes in immigration. But the bottom line is that when you do it through executive edict, you undermine the process. You undermine the need for legislation, and that also happens with stuff that's in legislation. Oftentimes, what we do with our legislation is that we embody the creation of like a new department or a new body that creates the rules, and then now in the future, new regulations, new rules, the kind of things that we are governed by on a day-to-day basis are no longer created by the people that we vote for. So our regulation, and for example, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, whether you like that institution or don't like that institution, it's sort of outside, and it was created sort of outside the purview of government in a way, so that way government can't necessarily touch it going forward. But again, that just takes the institutions that are supposed to be democratic outside of the democratic realm of our elected officials, and that concerns me.
Okay, thank you. Robin Laverne Wilson, your response.
So I thought about this quite a bit because it's kind of a conundrum. Because on one hand, what's the point of having checks and balances in the system if nobody's doing any checking or balancing? On the other hand, what's the point of electing someone to an executive position and not expect them to actually employ their executive power to make executive decisions? And so what I settled on is that what it really boils down to is, who is that executive? Who is the executive actually making those decisions? Because it's not the power, it's how the person uses the power. Obama made quite a few promises to close Guantanamo and did not invoke his executive powers to keep that promise and make it happen. And so, once again, it's not the power, it's what you do or don't do with it. So with that, this I think is a perfect opportunity for me to amplify Jill Stein and Ajamu Baraka as the best potential executive leaders we have for what seems to be the moral mood of the country right now in terms of restoring diplomacy and civility to our government. When you have someone who actually is a medical doctor, a healer, and an educator with that worldview, with executive power, and then you have on her right-hand person, Ajamu Baraka, who is a distinguished and accomplished human rights advocate, activist, and scholar. Again, these are really critical worldviews and positions of power to help us reset and change the political tone, direction, and culture of this country. So, once again, yes, the process matters, but what matters even more is the person who has the power to make those executive decisions and what they do with that power, which is why it is imperative that we vote our collective conscience on Tuesday, November 8th.
Thank you. Alex Merced, would you like to take a minute to respond?
Yes. Bottom line is, while the person matters, the problem is once the power is there, the power is there. And these are democratically elected officials. And elections change. I mean, take a look at these last couple of weeks. Every week, something new happens, and it's either Hillary or Trump leading. Okay, and I'll make my case for Gary Johnson in a moment. But bottom line, though, is it's scary. And trust me, if Donald Trump wins next week, you're going to suddenly hear everybody talking about how the executive should be very limited in power. So it should just be limited in power to begin with, so that way you don't run into a situation where you accidentally elect someone, and suddenly everyone's so scared of what they're going to do with that power. That's why you want diffuse checks and balances and all that stuff. And protecting it, regardless of intention, matters. So saying that, I understand Obama's frustration with gridlock, he still he should be very careful about how he uses the executive pen. And hey, he's used it less than George W. Bush, and both of them used it less than Bill Clinton. But the bottom line is, it does matter who is in there, and that's why the elections next week do matter. And at the end of the day, regardless of everything else, what does matter is judgment. And Gary Johnson has displayed judgment. I mean, whether it's running a business, being a governor, or climbing mountains. And I mean, if you climb Mount Everest and don't have good judgment, you die. So he's displayed consistent judgment in his life.
Robin Laverne Wilson, your response for 1 minute.
I would like to just take this as an opportunity to propose that in this whole sweeping change of culture and approach to our whole electoral process, again, all the more reason why we need to have more diversity of voices in the room with these decision-making opportunities as part of the process. And a different type of diversity than the type that we normally associate with identities such as gender or culture or creed or so on. But we need to have a diversity that reflects different aspects of society, such as the educators, scientists, engineers, healers, human rights activists, artists, etc., so that when these moments where there is important executive decisions to be made, it's not dominated by the voices of military, law, and industry.
Thank you. Our next question deals with some of the potential realities of if one of you were to be elected to our United States Senate. Specifically, if you were elected, you would likely be the only senator from your party. How do you plan to move forward your policy agenda within the two major parties in the United States Senate? Robin Laverne Wilson, please lead us off.
Thank you. Well, first, let's just say hypothetical best case scenario, I wouldn't be the only senator of my party. Best case scenario, Jill Stein and John Baraka are president and vice president. I become the senator of New York State. Arn Manconi becomes the senator of Colorado, and Margaret Flowers becomes the senator of Maryland. And even with that best case scenario, I would still employ the same exact strategy that I would November 9th, regardless of who wins, which is that we have to connect, collect, and correct. We have to get the grassroots together, because the problem is that in both of those houses of Senate and House of Representatives, so dominated by the lobby industry across all industries, the voice of regular people on the front lines, the grassroots, are not being heard. So as a true advocate of regular everyday people, a lot of listening, a lot of coalition building, a lot of getting people together in a room within an issue as well as across issues to break down the silos. Once we're all connected as a grassroots, then we can collect our grievances, because once we start to follow the money, we see that, and the same handful of people, once again, are profiting from our pain. We have more in common than what makes us dissimilar, regardless of what your class or gender or culture, etc. And then finally, because we've come together, because we've collected our grievances and we've connected the dots, then we can do the real work of correcting all of that. And once again, that comes from listening, that comes from getting people across the spectrum in the room and really being the advocate for those people. It also means listening to the progressive think tanks that already have amazing policy that they've been trying desperately to propose, but cannot get onto the radar of elected officials that are already bought and paid for by various lobby industries. So regardless of what happens November 9th, we all have to remain vigilant. We all have to stay connected and start to create builder capacity with coalition building in order to affect change. We have to continue to be watchdogs for whoever, even if it's Jill Stein, because we cannot put all of our hopes and dreams on one individual, on one representative. We really individually have to do the work regardless of what is the current administration. That is how I would work to get our legislation passed.
Thank you. Alex Merced, your response.
Yeah, so basically, if I'm elected U.S. Senator, one of the things I think will happen when you have a third-party U.S. Senator is that you can actually end the gridlock that way. Because the dynamic in Washington, D.C. is that the Republicans don't want to give the Democrats an inch because they always want to be on the winning side of every political dispute. The Democrats don't want to give the Republicans an inch because they want to be on the winning side of every political dispute. So there's no room for them to work together. So regardless of how things turn out, basically the only time things get done is if if one party can control all three branches of government and the Senate and the House. But if you have a third-party senator, if I was the Libertarian senator, and of course there is the possibility of people like Lily Tang in Colorado joining me, and Arvin Vohra in Maryland, or Phil Anderson in Wisconsin. But if I'm the only one, or even if there's only two of us or three of us, what can happen though is that we become the arbiter, we become the mediator between the two parties. So when there's good legislation that needs to be, where we can move the needle forward on, let's say, immigration reform or criminal justice reform or our foreign intervention, we can act as a conduit to help bring both parties to the table, because if they work through us, then they're not necessarily conceding to the other party, and you can get them both on good legislation. But on bad legislation that abridges your rights, that violates the Constitution, you will have us speaking out against both parties, because I'm not loyal to Republicans, I'm not loyal to Democrats. So if they want to violate your rights, they want to violate the Constitution, I'll be on the floor, and I will be sitting there, and I will filibuster a bill. I will read the entirety of human action into the congressional record if they try to abridge your rights, and that's a long book. But on top of that, there are people who I would approach first off, and I would want to build relationships. I'm not going there. I don't want to be sort of like a Ted Cruz who goes out of his way to sort of burn bridges. I want to build bridges because I want to move things forward. Two people who I'd reach out right away would be people like Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders, because I could probably bring both to the table on things like criminal justice reform and foreign policy, and then start introducing tripartisan legislation. Now that's a word I think I can get used to hearing, tripartisan legislation, and get that moving forward. So that would be my approach, and I'll leave it at that.
And I will be there to filibuster tweets of the people as a watchdog on the Senate floor whenever they try to sneak something slippery or shady through a bill's back door. I just want to say that language really matters, and so I reject the term third party. And the reason why is because, as you and I both know, there are 4 candidates for senator. There are 4 candidates for president of the United States. It's very insulting to automatically limit people's choices. That's further limited by the media dark out and lack of information. How about quad party partisanship, How about quint party? How about the fact that there really is potential for a lot more political representation for the Green and the Libertarian Party, so that we can have more of this dialogue and break up this duopoly that's just basically ruining our lives.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Alex Merced, would you like to take a minute to respond?
That's. I think we're pretty good on this one.
Yeah, let's shake on that one.
Let's shake on it.
Yeah.
In the spirit of camaraderie,
Yes.
we move to our penultimate question for the evening.
Ooh, that's a great word, penultimate.
Regarding the 2008 financial crisis, Dodd-Frank, the legislation, is meant to regulate the financial industry to prevent a crisis like the 2008 financial meltdown from happening again. Do you believe Dodd-Frank goes far enough? What do you think should be done to address financial risk-taking and to promote economic stability? We begin with Alex Merced.
Got it. Bottom line is, I'm not a big fan of the Dodd-Frank Act, because what it does is it doesn't necessarily mitigate risk taking. I mean, there's things like the Volcker Rule in there, and I feel like the Volcker Rule, I work in finance, I train people in the financial industry, so I see firsthand people who've lost their jobs, firms that have had basically have downsized and use this as an incentive to sort of streamline their businesses, and has had negative effects for middle class people, because not everybody who works in the financial industry are these rich fat cats that you probably imagine. Most of them aren't. But the bottom line is, well, there is an issue of excessive risk taking, but it has to do with a lot of different things. You have to understand where risk comes from. At the end of the day, investors are not just trying to pursue the highest return, they're trying to pursue a return that they're okay with for the risk that they're taking. Okay? In a sense. And there's different, and the thing is that risk has a very strong relationship to reward. So the only way for you to increase your potential return or your yield is to take more risk. And the only reason you would do that is if you're not getting enough now. So what kind of things reduce the amount of yield that people are getting? Things like taxes, inflation, etc. So basically, for example, let's say I have a 10% return on my portfolio. If I pay 35% in taxes, I now only have 6.5%. If inflation's at 3%, now I'm down to 3% return. People aren't making 10% on their return. Take a look at your retirement portfolio. You're not making 10% this year, more than likely. So when you start thinking about taxes and inflation, you really start people are losing money, so they're taking more risk to make up for it. You're pushing financial institutions to take more risk because they have to jump over those hurdles of inflation and taxes. But it's not just that. There's also actual Federal Reserve studies, I think it was the Federal Reserve of St. Louis, that have studies that show the effects of deposit insurance. I'm not against the idea of deposit insurance, but the idea is that you don't directly pay for your deposit insurance, which means there's no feedback mechanism. So think of car insurance. If you make a riskier decision, like you buy a car that's more likely to be stolen, you're going to pay more for car insurance. So that's going to incentivize you to maybe not buy that car because you want to pay less. In that case, you buy the car that's less likely to be stolen, and there's less likely of that situation happening because the premium you pay gives you information you otherwise wouldn't have, because you're not going to go do those statistical studies yourself. Insurance companies do, and they use that to help price things for you. So if people paid for the deposit insurance directly, they would price in the risk of the bank that you're banking with. So a riskier bank would be more expensive to have deposit insurance, and safer banks would be less expensive, and that would actually create a financial incentive for people to naturally put their money in safer banks. Right now, you don't have that dynamic. You're getting the same insurance whether it's the riskiest bank on the block or the safest bank on the block. So you're going to go wherever the highest savings rate is, which is the highest risk-taking bank. So capital just gravitates towards risk because we have these underlying incentives. So until we start rethinking things like and I'm all for social insurance. I'm all for things like unemployment insurance and deposit insurance, but I do think those can be delivered through a market. And I have a video on my website, alexmercedforny.com, where I explain how that can happen.
Thank you. Robin Laverne Wilson, your response.
Yes. I will confess that I am not anchored in finance and banking. So I'm not going to be able to quote as many wonderful statistics and percentages, but I think that I can still speak very strongly and confidently on behalf of so many working class people who hear all of that and say, but what about me? What about me who is saddled with student loan debt and can't even begin to think about investing and taking risk? Because the biggest risk that they've already taken is investing in an education that is supposed to hopefully lead to a better life, and still can't even find a living wage job. We can have all of these different kinds of regulations like Dodd-Frank, reminder that Glass-Steagall was repealed on Clinton, Mr. Clinton's turn?
Kind of, yeah.
Kind of. Let's let that sink in. Just saying, again, you can have a policy and a regulation, but there's always the underlying culture that needs to be addressed. And we have to change the culture away from greed and predation upon people. I understand the desire to take risk in order to acquire wealth, but not at the sacrifice of the security of everyday people. I'm thinking about all the regular Americans who had their pensions and their retirement funds gutted because of the disaster of the recession, because people who've had their homes taken from them because of the predatory mortgage lending. At the end of the day, you can quote all the statistics you want, but there needs to be greater protection for regular people and consumers. And that's not just going to happen by creating regulations that can be easily revoked and repealed depending on who happens to be in office. Unbridled growth is usually cancerous. So we need to shift our culture into less risk and more security and better balancing of resources and equality, so that when that risk does happen, it doesn't just benefit a very small handful of people, but everything is equalized so everybody has an equal chance at access to the stability of a home, a living wage, an education, and then eventually the stability to be able to invest in a retirement fund, because they're not spending all of their money for rent and maybe some food.
We'll take a moment for 1 minute responses.
Okay.
Alex Merced.
Yep. Main thing I want to say is, I lost my thought. But bottom line is, when it comes to 1999 and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, that was the act that sort of repealed Glass-Steagall. The thing is that Glass-Steagall was really two parts, and the main part of Glass-Steagall was the creation of the FDIC. The whole separation between investment banking and commercial banking was created because they were worried about the risk that FDIC insurance would mitigate. I mean, FDR was actually concerned. It was one of the few times that me and FDR actually agreed on something. And if you want to understand all my disagreements with FDR, you can go to learneconomicsnow.com, where I spend hours. But also at the same time, when it comes to the 2008 crisis, we have to think about the underestimation of risk. To me, the root cause didn't happen in the last 8 years. It happened over the last 100 years. Okay, and I have a video on this as well because it's a long story. But the bottom line is, we've had policy that has sort of stimulated the growth of housing prices over the last 100 years. So when you're a mathematician and you're crunching the numbers look like this. So you're going to drastically underpredict the potential risk because the numbers are influenced by our policy in the past. So we need to think about the way we manipulate prices. I'll leave it at that.
Robin Laverne Wilson, 1 minute.
The best way to deal with banks and other institutions that are too big to fail is to decentralize the economy and invest super locally in a Green New Deal, so that we have energy security. People have investments in community banks, utilities, worker-owned cooperatives, restore collective bargaining. These are the things that we also have to do to mitigate the abuses and the risks of the banking industry, predatory lending, and the banksters that still have yet to be held accountable.
Thank you. Regarding the issue of unions and a minimum wage or maximum wage, the Fight for 15 movement for a higher minimum wage across the country has been trying to expand gains for a $15 an hour minimum wage that we've seen in places like Seattle, and we also saw some policy regarding a kind of $15 minimum wage in New York State. It's a two-tiered system for downstate and upstate, and of course it won't be approaching $15 until a few years from now, when it's not as much as $15 would be now. Many states and cities have increased their minimum wage. Do you think the federal minimum wage should also rise to $15? And do you believe that the federal minimum wage should be indexed to inflation in the same way that, for instance, maximum campaign contribution limits to members of Congress and Senate are indexed to inflation? We begin with Robin Laverne Wilson.
I say yes, absolutely yes. Because if you leave the invisible hand to do as it wants to do, it's proven to be kind of an abusive hand, and that doesn't adequately feed the people. Yes, it should be indexed, because there is the reality that there's living standards that vary across the state and across the country. Case in point, when Bill de Blasio talked about A Tale of Two Cities, he was also talking about a tale of the entire state of New York, a tale of two states, because the two counties in New York, the ones with the highest and the lowest average household income, are right next to each other. New York County, which is Manhattan, and the Bronx, right next to each other. So the inequality that exists even within New York City is very apparent, but at the same time, of course, if you go upstate, it's a very different story. So the federal minimum wage should also have the clause that it is indexed to whatever is the standard of living in that community, annually adjusted to inflation. And yes, I think we should begin a conversation about a maximum wage because of the desperate need to reallocate resources and redistribute the wealth. We need a do-over. And I feel like, in addition, and by extension, the ways to emancipate the working class from wage slavery is to also go back and address and give a jubilee for student loan debt and mortgage debt relief from foreclosures. All of these are ways to invest in regular, average American people, whether they identify as middle class, working class, aspiring, otherwise. Pay people the value of their work and their time. That is the purpose of work. The purpose of work is to make sure that you're able to live in dignity with the basics that you need: a home and the food and the ability to move around to where you need to go to be able to work and fellowship with your friends, family, and community. And right now, the way that we are paying people makes it incredibly and exceptionally difficult for us to just function as basic human beings. Yes, federal minimum wage, yes. Indexed based upon the standard of living in that area, yes. Annual check-in based on inflation, and yes, federal recourse for a community if their municipality is not paying them adequately for the value of a hard day's work so that they can just live.
Thank you. Alex Merced,
Okay.
response.
Okay, I'm sure I'm probably gonna lose a lot of people on this, but bottom line is this: it costs local economies are very diverse. Like the cost of living in Rochester, New York, and your day-to-day expenses are super different than here in New York City. When I lived in Bowling Green, Ohio, I lived on minimum wage working at McDonald's, and for $4.20 a month, I had 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. Much better than I'm living now. I make significantly more now, and I can't afford a place of my own. Me and my wife, we're still living with my mother-in-law, and that's with 2 incomes. And actually, well, she just got laid off this morning, so 1 income now.
Oh no! I'm sorry.
That's life. But the point being is that the cost of living changes. So when you sit there and say nationally, one size fits all, $15 an hour. In some places, that might be the right spot. Like in places like Seattle, where you've seen them move $15 an hour, you have the effect hasn't necessarily been as pronounced as in other places that have done it, where basically they're natural, sort of where they were as an economy, where we're different. So you have, let's say, you start to have negative effects in economies that weren't necessarily ready for that jump. You can go look up when I think it was America Samoa, where they introduced the minimum wage, and pretty much the unemployment rate in American Samoa went up by a whole lot because their economy was not near as developed as other places. So I can understand trying to set sort of a minimum, but when with the country is so diverse, even within the state, again, Rochester versus New York City. So while I generally am personally against a minimum wage policy, if there is going to be one set, it should be done at the state or local level. And if you do it, then it should be indexed for inflation, because then what happens if you don't, it just becomes a political wedge tool every few years, and that's just a bad tool. That's the only reason when they do it, they don't put in the COLA, so that way they can bring it up again in a couple years elections and use it as a tool for getting out the vote. But just to understand why I take the view that I do, realize what a wage is. A job isn't a good or a service. It's a demand. So in the same way that hunger is a demand for food. So imagine that we created a minimum meal price. So I said every meal you eat has to be at least $10. Well, if I have to pay $10 for a meal, I'm not going to go to McDonald's. I'm going to go to Chipotle or Shake Shack. So then McDonald's just won't exist anymore in the market because there just won't be a price for that. And
I have no problems with that.
Well, okay, so hopefully I didn't just implant the idea for a minimum meal price all across the country. But the bottom line is you start pricing out alternatives. But again, if you did price out McDonald's, that would take out jobs with it. And people always cite McDonald's and its profits as an argument for a higher minimum wage. Although what they don't understand is that the people who actually employ the people at your local McDonald's is not McDonald's Corporation. They're franchises. I've actually crunched these numbers for McDonald's and Walmart, which are the two companies that people cite the most. There are articles I wrote at beinglibertarian.com if you want to look up those articles. I've also done podcasts on the subject on my podcast, the Alex Merced Cast, where I break down the numbers to make my case about the minimum wage. But again, as far as the federal minimum wage goes, I'm personally not for it.
Thank you. That was our final planned question.
I don't get to...
Oh, sorry.
I have a few things I'd like to say about that.
Sure, 1 minute responses.
Yes.
Beginning with Robin Laverne Wilson.
Well, I just found it problematic, the idea that a job is a demand. And yes, to an extent, yes, it is. However, I think, once again, changing policy and changing culture simultaneously, we've got to stop treating people as if they're just line items on a ledger and commodities. Okay, the whole reason why we have a society is so that human beings can live and thrive, not just survive, but thrive and have a family and have a home and then continue to contribute to society. And now it seems like most of us who are wage workers are just seen as expendable, and that's what's problematic. And so ensuring a livable wage federally is a way to ensure that all of our American citizens are treated and paid with the respect and dignity that they deserve for giving 2/3 of their waking life for that week towards somebody else's potential a profit margin. So, you know, the other thing you brought up about American Samoa, that it's an underdeveloped and exploited economy. That's what the issue is. And that comes from a lot of the imperialistic manipulation. And now what's happening is that same type of exporting economic exploitation of regular people is happening right here now on domestic soil. And the only way to mitigate that is to create a mandated living wage.
Mm-hmm. Alex Merced, 1 minute for you.
Okay. Bottom line is that it's not about line items and whatnot. People don't work to live. They don't live to work. So when you sit there and say people deserve a job, it's like saying that people... The purpose of their life is to work. The reason why jobs exist is because there's a demand for labor to produce things, because those are the things that we want in life. And there's a lot more to say about that. I'll just have to refer you guys to learneconomicsnow.com because I want to make one more point about the Philippines, because Robin mentioned about just forgiving mortgage debt, forgiving student loan debt, and that to me is also a bad idea. They used to do that in the Philippines. They used to have jubilees for taxes. NPR Planet Money actually did a piece on this, and every once in a while, and what happened is that people just learned to expect these jubilees, so they would just stop paying their taxes entirely, waiting for the next jubilee, and it took a lot of cultural change. Yes, I do think there are ways to help give people relief for student loans and housing, and I discussed that in my videos over there at alexmercedforny.com, but it can't come pain-free because then you don't fix the problem long run. There's a give and take that has to occur in the process.
Thank you. So that was our final scripted question for the evening. However, we did have a viewer request, and if both candidates are in agreement, the question basically suggesting the topic that we discuss is that of Israel and Palestine. U.S. Senator Chuck Schumer is arguably one of the most vocal advocates on the issue of U.S. policy with the state of Israel. Within the state of New York, in this past year, Governor Cuomo signed an executive order basically punishing any public or government-aligned entities that participate in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That is part of the movement to protest the state of Israel's policies against Palestine. So, are you two in agreement on spending 3 minutes each?
I'll say a few words.
Okay, great. So, addressing the issue of what your role as a U.S. Senator would be in terms of trying to influence United States policy towards Israel, and the issue of of BDS in New York State? Should boycott, divestment, and sanctions be considered a protected right as a form of free speech and political protest? And how do you feel about the policies within New York State regarding the BDS movement? We will begin with Alex Merced.
Okay, I'll just start off with, just like all sort of international disputes, whether it's Israel and Palestine, whether it's Pakistan in the stuff that's going on with Kashmir, or a lot of the other disputes around the world, or the things going on with Somalia and Boko Haram, honestly, I don't want the U.S. to sit there and be choosing sides, because that's what's caused more instability more times than not. And as we've gotten involved, especially in the Middle East, and we've decided who gets to be in charge in Iraq, Iran, Libya, Syria, etc., has only made that region more unstable, and that's made it more dangerous for both parties, Palestine and Israel. So I think the best thing we can do to create a more stable environment for them to find the peaceful resolution that they can live with, because at the end of the day, it's their land, it's their lives, they're the ones who should be having that conversation, would be for us to stay out of creating instability in that region. So I would take it. I would say I try to stay humble when it comes to the disputes of other countries, because it's their lives. I can't say that I have the day-to-day perspective to understand what's going on over there. So I would want the U.S. again foster trade relationships, foster diplomacy with other nations. But when they have disputes with other nations, for the most part, I'd rather the U.S. just kind of just not choose sides, because again, it's never worked out well for us in the past. But again, I want trade, I want diplomacy, I want us to have those relationships with other nations, them having a relationship with us, but not us getting involved in their relationships with others. Okay, I don't get it and butt into the relationships I have with people interpersonally. They have a relationship with me. But on that point, when it comes to investment, yes, individuals have a right to invest how they please. Now, of course, public funds can be used this way, that way, but at the end of the day, I do get concerned when people try to make political statements by the way public funds are used, because public funds are supposed to represent everybody. Everyone has such a diverse set of opinions. When you're using public funds to set a statement, you're going to be disenfranchising someone. So I'd rather you don't make a political statement through the way political funds, pension funds are used. And plus, at the end of the day, pension funds, the way they're calculated is based on an 8% discount rate. At the end of the day, that's hard enough to meet at it as it is. So honestly, pension fund managers, these restrictions only make it harder for them to kind of hit their investment goals to make sure people do have their retirements.
Thank you. Robin Laverne Wilson, your response?
We directly caused and contributed to many of the problems with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we say that we shouldn't choose sides, which I agree with, but yet we continue to, again, give money hand over fist to a country that continues consistently to enact human rights abuses. From an economic and electoral point of view, I frame it like this, and this is another form of the manipulation and the control of the oligarchy to influence things to their greatest benefit. We have BDS and we have Citizens United. Citizens United claims that an inanimate entity, a corporation, is actually a human being, and that it can use money to whatever extent it wants to actually influence politics. Now, the inverse of that is if an entity decides to withhold its money as a political statement against something that he, she, it, or they feel very strongly against, human rights abuses, we're punished for it. I just want that to land and to think about, once again, the double standard and the manipulation that is being made by basically criminalizing dissent, collective consent, and boycott, which has always been a cornerstone of making social political change throughout history, and especially in this country. So I think that absolutely we should come out of all imperialistic conflicts and wars in other countries, disrupting their economy, stop causing all these problems, stop giving away so much of our money to these countries when we should be investing in the livelihoods and stability and safety and security of people right here in the United States of America.
Thank you. That was the final question, and so we will now transition to candidate closing statements. You each will have, actually we can take a minute for responses. Alex Merced, would you like to take a minute to respond?
No, I think I stand by my previous statements. I'll leave it at that.
Robin Laverne Wilson.
Same here.
Okay.
I think we have some agreement on that one too.
So in some parts.
Yeah.
Then we will in fact move to candidate closing statements. You each have 5 minutes, and we will lead off with Robin Laverne Wilson.
5 minutes?
Well, that's your maximum. As much or little as you want.
Well, okay. My name is Robin Laverne Wilson. I'm also known as Dragonfly. My website is robinforsenator.com. On Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And I'm asking and imploring you to vote your conscience November 8th on Tuesday. The stakes are high for everyone, and that's also the reason why I say that I'm running for our lives. I can say that based on my background and my experience and the totality of my identity makes me very much in touch with people from all across the spectrum of society, people who, again, have hopes and dreams and aspirations of all kinds, people who have had to endure various forms of oppression or discrimination. All of those things come together in why I say that I'm running for our lives. I feel the stakes of the economy on one side and the ecology on the other. A little bit just about me. I'm 42 years old. I'm the daughter of a career military combat medic veteran from Korea and Vietnam. My mother was a military wife, a homemaker, and a domestic. I'm incredibly proud to be their youngest daughter. I went to a wonderful public school, an opportunity that it seems is less and less likely for current and ongoing generations, which is something that pains me deeply and would like to have an influence in sculpting and evolving. I believe that we need to have revolutionary town halls where we are actually looking into each other's eyes and going from adversary to allies and accomplices, where we're talking to each other rather than at each other, that we have an open and civil tone to our dialogue so that we can find solutions with each other rather than for each other, so that we can decentralize, unite, and move forward together. There's a lot of different solutions to the problem that we're all facing, and I think one commonality that we have is that we agree on what those problems are, even though we may have different solutions of how to get there. But I didn't even want to name this a debate, because language is so incredibly important, once again, in the way that we approach each other in our environment. So even though we may have had some rebuttals, I'd like to think that we set a model for what a really engaging civic dialogue and conversation can be moving forward. I think we need to become greater citizens and less consumers. I think we need to understand and separate the dovetail of capitalism and democracy. And I think that regardless of who ends up becoming the president of the United States or the senator of New York State, whether it's me, whether it's Alex, whether it's the incumbent, whether it's Jill Stein or otherwise, regardless, we still have to stay vigilant. We have to remain watchdogs. We have to continue to unite and build coalition regardless. And finally, again, as an artist and activist and aspiring educator, I'm anchored in being a culture maker, and that's what I bring to this campaign and to this election. I hope that the fact that I took the dare. And I said, I'm going to run for senator, because why not? Because we need more regular people to be representatives of the people, by the people, for the people. I hope I've inspired someone to consider running for office on any level. School board, president, senator, dog catcher. Doesn't matter. Step up and start nurturing our local leaders to eventually become our elected officials who can rise into places of power to truly represent us, because they were of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so I'm going to close with my campaign theme song as the culture worker that I am. I said I'm running for our lives, yeah. Politicians keep on lying. People keep on dying. I'm so tired of crying. And so I'm running for our lives. But it's not me, it's we who are running for senator. And so we're running for our lives, yeah. When the grassroots get connected, our grievances collected, we've got the power to correct it, because we're running for our lives, yeah.
Thank you, Green Party candidate Robin Laverne Wilson. Alex Merced, your closing statement.
Yes, so thank you guys for listening this evening. My name is Alex Merced. I'm the 2016 Libertarian Party candidate for U.S. Senate. But, you know, we may agree on some issues, we may disagree on others. But at the end of the day, I promise you, if I'm U.S. Senator, you're going to have accessibility, thoughtfulness, and transparency. And I encourage you, everyone, regardless of how you're going to vote for principle. When you vote for someone like Robin, when you vote for someone like me, you are voting for principle. You're voting for candidates who believe in what they're saying, and they're only doing it because they believe. And that's what we need more of. And we need more competition in our electoral system, so that we can hold the people who are elected and in office accountable, because that way they don't feel like every election is just a coronation, and that they actually have to go make their case to the people. I mean, people like Chuck Schumer really didn't start campaigning until the last couple of weeks. He dropped
really
a couple,
didn't.
dropped a couple $1 million on TV ads and said, "Hey, it's a coronation." While me and Robin were traveling the state of New York over these last 6 months and making our case to the people. We've both been to Rochester, places like Syracuse, all over the state, and that's how you represent people. That's how you communicate with people. So I want people in the Libertarian Party. I want people in the Green Party. I want you guys to reach out to each other. We disagree on a lot of things. That's fine. But the main thing is that what we both want is we both want a seat at the table. We both want to have ability to express our voice. If we work together, we can remove a lot of those electoral barriers, whether they're ballot access laws and other structural reforms, and looking into, on local levels, change the way we vote. Looking into things like approval voting would make a huge difference. But if we work together, we can make those changes happen.
I agree.
So please, make sure this is the beginning of a dialogue between both parties to really make sure that we have a seat at the table, so that way we're not subject to this duopoly that just keeps electing the lesser of evils. And then every time the next election, the two evils are even worse. So then people always say, well, we can try to reform things at the next election, but the next election they're only worse. So we need to really start pushing for that now. But I also, for those of you who are interested in some of the things that I've said today, please like my Facebook page, Alex Merced, facebook.com/AlexMercedLP. Check out the campaign website, Alex Merced for NY. Subscribe to my podcast, The Alex Merced Cast. And also check out Libertarian101.com, where basically I have videos answering every question that people have about libertarianism, and LearnEconomicsNow.com, where I have pretty much videos discussing every economics question people have. Because at the end of the day, whether you disagree with me or not, or agree with me or not, long as we understand these issues, we can have a discussion about these issues.
Yes.
So I know for both of us, education and getting people to understand these things is a big thing. So thank you guys for having us. And again, we are humbly asking to be considered as your servant here as the U.S. Senator of New York. And we are here to ask you to vote principle, don't vote power.
Absolutely.
Yep, because power without principle is just corruption.
Thank you, Libertarian candidate Alex Merced. That concludes our U.S. Senate debate live stream for the U.S. Senate race 2016 for New York. I want to thank everyone who tuned in, everyone who shared this live stream and promoted it on your pages and groups and your organizations. I would also like to thank everyone who helped make this live stream happen.
Yes.
And everyone, don't forget to vote on Tuesday, and especially keep fighting the next day and the day after that.
Absolutely.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.